Tonight, we're going back, a very long way back, to a place that no longer exists on any modern map, and yet a place that shaped almost everything about the world you live in right now. We're going to ancient Mesopotamia. The word itself comes from ancient Greek, mesos, meaning middle, and potamos, meaning river. Mesopotamia, the land in the middle of the rivers. And that is exactly what it was. Nestled between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, this land stretched across what is now modern Iraq, with smaller reaches into Syria, Turkey, and Kuwait. Two rivers, flowing roughly parallel to one another, making their long journey southward until they eventually emptied into the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. For thousands and thousands of years, those two rivers were everything. They flooded in the spring, depositing rich dark silt across the land when they receded. That silt, that quiet, annual gift of the rivers, made the soil extraordinarily fertile. In a region otherwise surrounded by harsh desert and dry, rocky highlands, this narrow ribbon of land between the rivers was, in a very real sense, miraculous. Things grew here. Things grew well. And so, people came. Not all at once, not in any dramatic rush, but slowly, tentatively, the way people have always moved toward warmth and food and water. Small groups of hunter-gatherers began lingering near the riverbanks. This was perhaps as far back as 12,000 years ago, during the tail end of the last ice age, when the climate of the whole planet was quietly shifting, becoming a little warmer, a little more welcoming. At this time, the Persian Gulf was actually smaller than it is today. The coastline sat further inland, and the mouths of the Tigris and Euphrates extended much further out into what is now open water. The landscape of ancient Mesopotamia looked genuinely different from what we would recognize. The marshes in the south were vast, enormous, shallow, reed-filled wetlands that stretched for miles in every direction. And in those marshes, life was abundant. Fish, waterfowl, wild boar, date palms heavy with fruit. It was, by the standards of the ancient world, a place of plenty. The earliest people who settled here were not yet farmers in the way we think of farming. They were foragers, skilled, knowledgeable, deeply connected to the rhythms of the rivers and the seasons. They knew when the fish ran. They knew which reeds could be woven into baskets strong enough to hold water. They knew, in short, how to live here. But then something changed. Slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum, people in this region, and across the wider ancient Near East, began to do something new. They began to plant seeds deliberately, to tend them, to return to the same patch of earth, season after season, to stay. The shift from foraging to farming happened gradually across thousands of years, and it didn't happen all at once in Mesopotamia. The earliest evidence of agriculture in the broader region comes from the highlands to the north and east, places like the Zagros Mountains along what is now the Iran-Iraq border, and the Piedmont zones of what is now southeastern Turkey. Wheat and barley were the first crops. Goats and sheep were among the first animals to be herded rather than hunted. These practices filtered down toward the river valley over time, and when farming met the fertile silt of the Tigris and Euphrates floodplains, something remarkable became possible. A single farming family, working the alluvial soil of Mesopotamia, could produce far more food than that family alone could eat. Surplus. For the first time in human experience, there was extra. There was enough left over to store, enough to share, Enough, eventually, to trade. And surplus changes everything. When a community produces more than it needs to survive, it can support people who don't farm. Specialists, potters, weavers, people who keep track of the stored grain, people who make decisions about how the surplus is distributed. Villages can grow. Strangers can be fed. Cooperation becomes possible at a scale that was simply never practical before. This is where our story truly begins, not with a king, not with a war, not with a monument, but with a quiet transformation in the soft, dark earth beside a river, somewhere around 8,000 years ago. The seeds of civilization, quite literally, being pressed into the ground. Rest now. Let that image settle with you. A river, dark soil, a handful of grain, and everything that followed from it. A handful of grain pressed into dark riverbank soil, and the very first stirrings of something new. We move forward, not by centuries, but by millennia. Because in Mesopotamia, change came slowly, the way a river reshapes a landscape. You can't see it happening, but look away long enough, and everything is different. By around 6,000 years before the birth of Christ, the land between the rivers had changed profoundly. Scattered farming villages had grown, not into cities yet, not quite, but into something more than simple settlements. Clusters of mud brick homes, arranged not randomly, but with a kind of intention. Shared storage buildings, common areas, the earliest hints of community planning, of people making collective decisions about how to live together. Archaeologists call this era the Ubaid period, named after a small mound in southern Iraq, Tel al-Ubaid, where traces of this culture were first uncovered in the 1920s. What they found there, and at dozens of sites across Mesopotamia, painted a picture of a society quietly becoming more sophisticated with every passing generation. The people of the Ubaid period made pottery. This might sound unremarkable, but their pottery tells us something important. Across an enormous geographic area, from the Persian Gulf in the south all the way up to the foothills of Anatolia in the north, their ceramic style was strikingly similar. The same painted geometric patterns, the same shapes, the same techniques. This kind of cultural consistency, spread across such vast distances, suggests these communities were not isolated from one another. They were trading, communicating, sharing ideas across hundreds of miles of river valley. They were also building something that would define Mesopotamia for thousands of years to come: temples. In nearly every Ubaid settlement of significant size, archaeologists have found a public building set apart from the rest, raised slightly, larger than the homes around it, oriented carefully, often toward the cardinal directions. These were the earliest temples of Mesopotamia, not the towering ziggurats that would come later, but their humble ancestors. Simple rectangular structures of mud brick, with the first hints of the architectural features that would eventually become iconic. The temple mattered here in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from a modern vantage point. It wasn't simply a place of worship. It was the economic and social center of the community. Surplus grain was stored there. Labor was organized from there. The earliest administrators, the people who kept track of who owned what and who owed what to whom, were almost certainly connected to the temple. Religion and governance, in these early communities, were not two separate things. They were one. And then, around 4000 BCE, something accelerated. Historians call it the Uruk period, named after the great city of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, a city that, at its height, may have been the largest settlement on Earth. And Uruk didn't just grow. It exploded. By around 3500 BCE, estimates suggest that somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000 people were living within and immediately around this single city. At a time when most of the world's population lived in scattered villages of a few hundred people, Uruk was something categorically different, something genuinely new. Walking through Uruk at its height would have been disorienting, even overwhelming. The sounds of a city, thousands of voices, animals, tools striking stone and clay, the smell of cooking fires and the river, narrow streets winding between high mud brick walls, and rising above it all, on an elevated platform of packed earth and brick, the great temple complex, known to archaeologists as the Inanna district, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, the divine embodiment of love, war, and the fertility of the land. The temples of Uruk were extraordinary. One structure, known as the White Temple, was coated in white plaster that would have gleamed in the Mesopotamian sun, visible for miles across the flat southern plain. Its corners were oriented toward the compass points. Its interior contained altars, ritual spaces, and the earliest administrative offices humanity has ever left a clear trace of. And it is in those administrative offices, in that temple complex, in that teeming city beside the Euphrates River, that something was invented which would change the human story forever. Writing. Not fully formed, not yet, but the very first steps. Temple administrators needed to keep track of enormous quantities of goods. How much grain had come in? How much had gone out? How many workers had been paid? And with what? Numbers and symbols pressed into soft clay tablets with a stylus. Not stories, not yet, but records, counts. The earliest known writing in human history is in essence an accountant's ledger. There is something quietly wonderful about that. The first thing humanity ever wrote down was not a poem or a prayer. It was a receipt. And from that humble, practical beginning, a clay tablet and a stick, would eventually grow literature, law, astronomy, and history itself. Let that settle quietly as you drift. A city glowing white in the desert sun. A scribe pressing a stylus into wet clay. The world, for the first time, learning to remember itself. A great white temple rising above the plains. A scribe pressing symbols into wet clay for the very first time. The world learning, in the most modest and practical of ways, to remember itself. We are now in the period historians call the early dynastic, the age of ancient Sumer. And Sumer, it is worth pausing to appreciate, is one of the most remarkable civilizations that has ever existed on this earth. Not because it was the most powerful, not because it built the tallest monuments, but because it was, in so many ways, the first. The place where so many of the things we take for granted, cities, writing, law, mathematics, organized religion, literature, appeared in the world for the very first time. The Sumerians did not call themselves Sumerians. That name comes to us from later peoples who looked back and named the region. They called their land something close to the civilized land, or the land of the noble lords. They were a people with a profound sense of their own identity and their own importance. And they were not wrong to feel that way. By 3100 BCE, the loose collection of cities that had grown up across southern Mesopotamia had each developed their own character, their own patron deity, their own ruling class. These were the Sumerian city-states. Uruk was one. Ur was another, a city we will return to in later chapters, full of gold and grief and wonder. There was also Nippur, the great religious center. Lagash, Kish, Eridu, one of the oldest of them all, a city so ancient that the Sumerians themselves believed it was the very first city ever built, the place where kingship first descended from the heavens. Each city was, in a meaningful sense, its own world. It had its own walls, thick, towering mud brick walls, built to keep out not just enemies but floods. It had its own farmland spreading out around it, worked by citizens who owed labor and grain to the temple. It had its own army, its own merchants, its own craftspeople. And presiding over all of it, both as a spiritual and a practical matter, was the temple. And the temple now had a new, magnificent form. The ziggurat. Say the word slowly and it almost sounds like what it is, something ancient and immovable. The ziggurats of Sumer were massive stepped pyramid structures built from millions of mud bricks, rising in great terrace stages toward the sky. They were not tombs, as the Egyptian pyramids were. They were mountains. Artificial mountains, built in a landscape that had none, because the Sumerians believed their gods lived on mountaintops, and if the land offered no mountains, they would simply build them. At the top of each ziggurat was a small temple shrine, a sacred space where the god of the city would descend and dwell. The ziggurat of the city of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, still stands today in the Iraqi desert, eroded, ancient, and breathtaking. To stand at its base and look upward is to feel, across 5,000 years, exactly what its builders intended you to feel. Small, reverent, close to something vast. But let us return to the clay tablets, because writing, in this period, was undergoing its own transformation. Those earliest tokens and symbols from the Uruk period, practical, numerical, designed purely to track commodities, were slowly, over centuries, evolving into something far more flexible and powerful. The script we call cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, for the distinctive wedge-shaped marks made by pressing a reed stylus into clay, began to expand beyond mere accounting. Scribes discovered that the symbols they used didn't have to represent only things. They could represent sounds. A picture of a mouth didn't have to mean mouth. It could represent the sound that the word for mouth made. And if you could represent sounds, you could eventually write anything. Any word, any thought, any story. This was one of the great intellectual leaps in human history, and it happened quietly, anonymously, in the schools and temples of Sumer. We don't know the names of the people who made this leap. We likely never will. But the consequence of what they worked out, that marks on clay could capture not just numbers but language itself, reverberates all the way to these very words you're hearing now. The schools where scribes were trained were called adaba, the Sumerian word meaning tablet house. Young students, almost always boys from privileged families, would spend years learning to read and write cuneiform. The curriculum was demanding. They copied lists of words, of animals, of professions, of geographical features. They practiced until the marks flowed from their stylus with ease. Some of their practice tablets have survived. On a few of them, alongside the careful exercises, A student has scratched something unplanned, a complaint about a teacher, a small doodle, a tiny act of rebellion that has somehow outlasted empires. 4,000 years later, a student's boredom is still entirely recognizable. Let the world of these ancient students settle gently in your mind. A cool room, smelling of damp clay. The soft sound of styluses pressing carefully into tablets. A teacher walking slowly between rows of bent heads. Outside, the sounds of the city going about its eternal business. And somewhere in that room, a child pressing words, real words, human words, into the earth for the very first time. From those quiet tablet houses, we move forward now. The cities of Sumer are growing. Their walls are taller, their temples grander, their populations larger and more complex than anything the world has seen before. The Sumerian city-states were neighbors in the way that proud, prosperous, independent nations are neighbors, which is to say, not always peacefully. They shared a language, a religion, a broadly common culture. But they also shared rivers and farmland and trade routes. And those things, in the ancient world as in the modern one, were worth fighting over. The earliest recorded war in human history took place between two Sumerian cities, Lagash and Umma, over a disputed strip of fertile borderland called the Giudina, the field of 1,000 grievances. The two cities fought over it, negotiated over it, signed treaties about it, and then fought over it again, generation after generation, for nearly 200 years. We know this because they wrote it all down. Kings commissioned inscriptions on great stone monuments recording their victories, their justifications, their righteous anger at the other side's betrayal of agreements. The oldest known peace treaty in human history comes from this conflict. And even in that ancient document, you can hear a familiar, weary human note, the sense that both sides believed, completely sincerely, that they were the wronged party. It was also during this early dynastic period that the institution of kingship truly solidified in Mesopotamia. Earlier rulers had been something closer to high priests or city managers, their authority rooted primarily in the temple. But now a new kind of figure emerged, the warrior king, a man whose power rested not just on divine favor but on military prowess, on the loyalty of an army, on the ability to protect the city's walls and extend its reach. The Sumerians had a concept for Lugal, their word for king, which translates literally as big man. And the Lugals of the early dynastic period were, by any measure, remarkable figures. They built, they conquered, they commissioned poetry in their own honor. Some of them, the records suggest, genuinely believed themselves to be patently divine, bridges between the mortal world of their citizens and the immortal world of the gods. One of the most famous of these early kings is a figure named Gilgamesh, ruler of Uruk. He appears in the Sumerian king lists, ancient documents recording the rulers of each city in sequence, as a historical person. But he is far more famous as a legend. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which we will touch on again in later chapters, is the oldest known work of literature in human history. And at its heart is a question that Gilgamesh himself, whether historical or mythological, cannot stop asking. The same question that has haunted every human being who has ever lived. Why must we die? But tonight, we travel to a place that holds some of the most astonishing archaeological discoveries ever made. We travel to the city of Ur, and we go underground. In the 1920s and 1930s, A British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley led excavations at the ancient site of Ur, in what is now southern Iraq. What he found beneath the desert floor stunned the world. A royal cemetery, containing the tombs of Sumerian kings and queens dating back to around 2600 BCE. And inside those tombs, objects of such breathtaking beauty and craftsmanship that they are difficult to fully believe even now, displayed in the museums of London and Philadelphia and Baghdad, where many of them reside today. Gold headdresses made of hammered leaves so delicate they tremble in a breath of air. Lyres decorated with the golden head of a bull, its beard made of lapis lazuli imported all the way from the mountains of Afghanistan. Gaming boards inlaid with shell and red limestone, still containing their playing pieces, waiting for a game that has not been played in 4,500 years. But it was not only the beauty of these objects that made Woolley stop and stare in silence. Alongside the kings and queens, buried with them in the great stone chambers, were other people. Dozens of them, in some cases. Soldiers, still wearing their copper helmets. Handmaidens in their finest jewelry. Musicians, still positioned near their instruments. All of them apparently having walked willingly into the tomb, taken a small cup of something, likely a sedative drink, lain down in their appointed place, and gone to sleep. The Sumerians called these the death pits. Woolley found evidence of this practice in 16 of the royal tombs. The most elaborate belonged to a woman named Puabi, a queen, or perhaps a high priestess, whose title is still debated, around whom were found the remains of 52 attendants who had followed her into death. We do not fully understand why, whether it was considered an honor, whether it was a choice freely made or one made under pressure that left no real alternative. The clay tablets have not told us this particular secret. Perhaps they never will. What we know is that those people were dressed in their finest things, that they were arranged with care, that someone, standing above ground as the tomb was sealed, thought this was the right and proper way to send a great soul into whatever came next. Rest now with that quiet mystery, the desert above, wide and star-filled and indifferent. The tomb below, sealed and dark and very, very still. And somewhere between the two, the ancient Sumerians sensed that death was not an ending, but a doorway, and that no one, not even a queen, should have to walk through it entirely alone. The tombs of Ur have been sealed now for many centuries. The cities of Sumer continue their long, proud, quarrelsome existence, trading, building, fighting, negotiating, building again. The ziggurats still rise against the flat southern sky. The scribes still press their wedge-shaped marks into soft clay in the cool quiet of the tablet houses. But something is coming, something that will change the shape of Mesopotamia entirely. It comes from the north. To the north of the great Sumerian cities, across the middle reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, lived a different people. They spoke a different language, a Semitic language, related in its deep structure to what would eventually become Arabic and Hebrew, and they had their own traditions, their own ways of organizing a community, their own gods. They were not newcomers to the region. They had lived alongside the Sumerians for a very long time, absorbing much of Sumerian culture, adapting it, making it their own. But they had not yet produced an empire. That was about to change, and the man who would change it had a name that history has never forgotten. Sargon. We don't know a great deal about Sargon's origins with any certainty, which is part of what makes him so fascinating. What we do have is a legend, one he may well have cultivated himself, because Sargon understood, with a sophistication that feels remarkably modern, the power of a good story. According to that legend, Sargon was born in secret to a mother who could not keep him. She placed him in a basket of rushes, sealed it with bitumen, and set him adrift on the Euphrates River. A man named Aki, a gardener who drew water from the river, found the basket, took the child in, and raised him as his own. From those humble beginnings, or so the story went, the greatest conqueror the world had yet seen would rise. You may notice that this story sounds familiar. It should. Versions of the same tale appear across many cultures and many centuries, including one you almost certainly know well. The floating basket, the humble upbringing, the extraordinary destiny. These are the recurring shapes that human beings give to the lives of those they consider truly great. Whether or not it is literally true, the legend of Sargon's origins served a clear purpose. It said that greatness did not require noble blood, that the gods could choose anyone. That power, legitimate power, came not from the family you were born into but from the favor of the divine and the force of your own will. What we know with more confidence is that around 2334 BCE, Sargon, who had risen to a position of considerable influence in the city of Kish, launched a series of military campaigns that would, within a relatively short span of years, bring the entirety of Mesopotamia under his control. City after city fell before him. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, the proud independent city-states of Sumer, which had maintained their fierce autonomy for so many centuries, were absorbed one by one into something new. An empire. The word itself feels significant, because what Sargon created was genuinely the first empire in recorded human history. Not merely a dominant city, not a confederation of allies, but a single political entity stretching from the Persian Gulf in the south all the way to the Mediterranean coast in the northwest, a territory encompassing thousands of miles, dozens of cultures, and an almost incomprehensible variety of peoples and languages. He called his capital city Akkad. We have never found it. Despite more than a century of searching, archaeologists have not been able to locate the ruins of Akkad with any certainty, a mystery that would have delighted the city's founder. Perhaps this man who was himself so difficult to locate in the historical record. The empire takes its name from that lost city. We call it the Akkadian Empire, and at its height, it was unlike anything the world had previously produced. Sargon ruled for approximately 56 years. He conducted military campaigns not just within Mesopotamia but far beyond it, into Anatolia, into the Zagros Mountains, possibly even to the islands of the Persian Gulf and the distant shores of what is now Oman. He standardized weights and measures across his empire, so that a merchant in the far north and a merchant in the deep south were working from the same system. He installed governors loyal to himself in the conquered cities rather than leaving local rulers in place, one of the first examples in history of what we might recognize as a centralized administrative state. And he made his daughter a goddess. Her name was Enheduanna, and she was appointed high priestess of the moon god Nana in the city of Ur. But she was far more than a political appointment. Enheduanna was a poet, a brilliant, passionate, theologically complex poet whose hymns to the goddess Inanna have survived in dozens of ancient copies, suggesting they were treasured and reproduced for centuries after her death. She is the earliest named author in human history. Not the earliest writer. Writing had existed for centuries before her, but the earliest person to write and to sign their name to what they wrote. To say, in effect, I made this. These words are mine. Her hymns pulse with genuine feeling, with love for her goddess, with outrage when she is wronged, with the full force of an extraordinary personality pressing itself into the clay. To read them, even in translation, is to feel the unmistakable presence of an individual human being reaching across 4,000 years. The Akkadian Empire did not last forever. Empires never do. After Sargon's death, his sons and grandsons struggled to hold together what he had built. A semi-nomadic people from the Zagros Mountains, known as the Gutians, invaded from the east. Droughts and famines weakened the agricultural base. Internal rebellions flickered and spread. By around 2154 BCE, roughly 2 centuries after Sargon had first begun his campaigns, the Akkadian Empire had fragmented and collapsed. But it had changed the idea of what was possible. It had shown the ancient world that one ruler, one city, one vision could reach across the horizon in every direction and call it all home. Let that image carry you quietly forward. A vast flat land under a vast flat sky. A king somewhere at the center of it, and roads running outward from him in every direction like the spokes of a wheel, carrying his messengers, his merchants, his soldiers, his laws. The first man to stand at the middle of the world, and look out in every direction and call it his. The Akkadian Empire has fallen. The great roads that once carried Sargon's messengers in every direction have grown quiet. The cities of Mesopotamia, after 2 centuries of imperial unity, are finding their own way again, some thriving, some diminished, all of them adjusting to a world that feels, after the grandeur of empire, strangely smaller. This period of fragmentation does not last long by the standards of ancient history. Because Sumer, it turns out, is not finished, not even close. Around 2112 BCE, a king named Yornamu rises to power in the city of Yor, the same Yor of the golden headdresses and the royal tombs, the same Yor wherein Hedjuana served as high priestess, a city with deep roots and a long memory. And under Yornamu, that city becomes once again the beating heart of Mesopotamia. Historians call what follows the third dynasty of Yor, or simply Yor third, and it represents one of the most remarkable periods of organized, deliberate civilization building that the ancient world ever produced. If the Akkadian Empire was a story about the reach of military power, Yor 3 is a story about something quieter, and in many ways more enduring. It is a story about administration, about law, about the profound human desire to create order out of chaos, and to write that order down so that it cannot be forgotten or disputed or conveniently misremembered by those with power. Yornamu built. He built magnificently. The great ziggurat of Yor, the one whose eroded remains still stand in the Iraqi desert today, was either constructed or substantially rebuilt under his reign. It rose in 3 massive terrace stages, faced with baked brick, its corners oriented to the compass points, its summit lost in whatever the sky was doing that day. It was an act of devotion, yes, but it was also an act of politics, a statement pressed into the landscape itself. This city matters. This king matters. Look up and remember. But Yornamu's most consequential act was not architectural. It was legal. He produced what is now recognized as the oldest surviving law code in human history, older than Hammurabi's famous code, which we will come to in the next chapter, by more than 300 years. The laws of Yornamu were written in Sumerian, pressed into clay tablets, and promulgated across the empire. They dealt with matters that feel, across 4,000 years, entirely familiar. Theft, bodily injury, the rights of widows and orphans, false accusations, the proper conduct of judges. What strikes modern readers most forcefully is not how foreign these laws seem, but how recognizable. There are provisions protecting the weak from the strong. There are penalties for corrupt officials. There is, running through the whole document, a sense that justice is not simply the will of the most powerful person in the room, that it is something more abstract, more durable, more worthy of being written down and preserved. The preamble to the laws states that Yornamu was chosen by the gods to bring justice to the land, to ensure that the orphan did not fall victim to the wealthy, that the widow did not fall victim to the powerful, that the man of 1 shekel did not fall victim to the man of 1 mina. These are not the words of a tyrant. They are the words of someone who understood, or wanted to be understood as understanding, that power carries an obligation, that to rule is not only to take, but to protect. Alongside the law code, the Your Third period produced something perhaps even more astonishing in its sheer scale. A bureaucracy so vast, so thorough, so almost obsessively detailed that it has left us with hundreds of thousands of surviving clay tablets, more written records from this single century-long period than from many entire ancient civilizations combined. The administrators of Your Third recorded everything. And we mean everything. The number of fish delivered to a temple kitchen on a specific day. The exact quantity of wool allocated to a specific weaver in a specific workshop. The daily rations of bread and beer provided to laborers on a construction project. The names of those laborers. The names of their supervisors. The names of the oxen used to pull the cats. The oxen had names. There is something both wonderful and faintly comic about this. These ancient accountants, bending over their clay tablets in the lamplight, making sure that not a single fish, not a single bundle of reeds, not a single day's labor went unrecorded. It speaks to a society with tremendous confidence in the power of the written record. A society that believed, with apparent sincerity, that if something was not written down, it might as well not have happened at all. In this they were, of course, entirely right. We know their names because they wrote them down. We know the names of their oxen because they wrote those down too. Everything they did not write down has vanished into the silence from which all unrecorded history cannot be recovered. The Your Third Empire was also a trading civilization of remarkable reach. Merchants traveled under royal protection, one of the earliest systems of something resembling diplomatic immunity, carrying textiles and grain outward and returning with timber, metals, and precious stones. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from the mountains of Lebanon, copper from the Persian Gulf region. The economy of Your Third was not a simple local affair. It was embedded in a vast network of exchange that stretched across much of the known world. And then, as had happened before, and would happen again, the edges began to fray. A semi-nomadic people called the Amorites were pressing in from the western deserts, not in a single dramatic invasion but in the slow, irresistible way that populations move when they are hungry and the land ahead of them seems to offer more than the land behind. Simultaneously, a people called the Elamites, from the highlands to the east, in what is now southwestern Iran, were growing in strength and ambition. The end, when it came, was swift. Around 2004 BCE, the Elamites sacked the city of Ur. A Sumerian poet, writing in the aftermath, composed what is known as the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, one of the most moving pieces of ancient literature ever recovered. It describes the goddess Ningal pleading with the higher gods to spare her city. It describes the fires, the silence where there had been noise, the emptiness where there had been life. The city, verily it is destroyed, the poet wrote. The people moan. There is no record of who wrote these words. No name pressed into the corner of the tablet, as in Hedjuana had once pressed hers. But the grief in them needs no signature. It is grief that any person, in any century, in any city that has ever been lost, would recognize without being told what it means. Settle into that quiet now. The great ziggurat still standing above a changed city. A poet sitting somewhere in the ruins or the exile, pressing loss into clay with steady hands. Writing it down so that it would not be forgotten. So that we, listening in the dark 4,000 years later, would know that it happened, that it mattered, that the people who lived there were real. The lamentation over Ur has faded now into the long silence of the centuries. The Elamites have withdrawn back to their eastern highlands. The Amorites, those pastoral people who pressed in from the western deserts, have settled, have built, have, as people always do when they stay long enough in a place, become something new. Because that is one of the great recurring patterns of Mesopotamian history. The outsider arrives, the outsider disrupts, and then, almost without exception, the outsider is absorbed, drawn in by the extraordinary gravitational pull of this civilization, its writing, its gods, its accumulated knowledge, its ways of organizing a life, until the distinction between the newcomer and the ancient resident becomes impossible to draw with any confidence. The Amorites built cities, and the greatest city they built, or rather the city they took and transformed and made magnificent, sat on the banks of the Euphrates River in the middle reaches of Mesopotamia. It had existed as a modest settlement for centuries. Under Amorite rule, it would become the most powerful city in the ancient world. Its name was Babylon. The city of Babylon. Even the word carries weight. It conjures something, towers and gardens and excess and fall. Much of what we think we know about Babylon comes from sources written by its enemies, which is to say it comes distorted, exaggerated, filtered through the particular lens of people who feared it and resented it and wanted very much to see it humbled. The true Babylon, the historical Babylon, was something more nuanced and in many ways more interesting than the legend. At the height of its first great flowering, the period historians call the Old Babylonian period, Babylon was a city of perhaps 100,000 people. In the ancient world, that made it extraordinary, a vast, breathing, cosmopolitan place where merchants from distant lands rubbed shoulders in the marketplaces, where the smell of the river mingled with cooking smoke and the sharp scent of bitumen from the construction sites, where the great temple of the god Marduk, the Asagila, rose above the rooftops and the flat southern sky pressed down over everything like a warm hand. And into this city, around 1792 BCE, stepped a king, Hammurabi. He ruled for 42 years. He expanded Babylon's territory through a combination of military campaigns and shrewd diplomacy, playing his rivals against one another with a patience and political intelligence that his correspondence, preserved in clay, reveals in remarkable detail. His letters survive. We can read them, and in them, Hammurabi comes across not as a distant divine figure but as a working ruler, engaged, practical, sometimes impatient, sometimes surprisingly warm. In one letter he personally intervenes to ensure that an elderly woman receives the land she is owed. In another he instructs a governor to investigate a complaint promptly and not let the matter drag. He sounds, across nearly 4,000 years, like a man who has a great deal to do and a finite amount of time in which to do it. But Hammurabi's most enduring legacy is carved into a column of black basalt stone that stands nearly 2.5 meters tall, and which today resides in the Louvre Museum in Paris, one of the most visited objects in the entire collection. The Code of Hammurabi. It contains 282 laws. They cover an astonishing range of human situations: commerce, property, marriage, inheritance, adoption, debt, wages, professional conduct, and violence. At the top of the stele, carved in high relief, Hammurabi stands before the sun god Shamash, who is depicted handing him the symbols of justice and authority. The message is unmistakable and intentional. These laws do not come from a king who decided them arbitrarily. They come from the gods themselves. To break them is not merely a legal transgression. It is an offense against the divine order of the universe. Some of the laws feel strikingly familiar. A builder who constructs a house that collapses and kills the owner shall be put to death. A merchant who charges more interest than the law permits shall forfeit everything he lent. Judges who change their verdicts after delivering them shall be publicly disgraced and permanently removed from the bench. Others feel distant in ways that reveal the enormous gulf between that world and ours, laws that assign different punishments for the same offense depending on whether the victim is a free person, a freed person, or an enslaved one. Laws that treat women's lives as governed primarily by the men around them. The Code of Hammurabi is not a perfect document of justice. It is a document of its time, which is to say it is partly admirable and partly troubling, as most honest records of human civilization tend to be. But the impulse behind it, to write the rules down, to make them visible, to say that even kings are bound by something larger than their own desires, that impulse is one of the genuinely noble recurring threads of Mesopotamian civilization. Away from the palace and the law courts, daily life in old Babylonian times had a texture and warmth that the clay tablets bring vividly to life. The Babylonians drank beer, enormous quantities of it, through long reed straws that filtered out the grain solids. Beer was not an indulgence but a staple, provided as daily rations to workers and temple staff, brewed in homes and commercial establishments alike, and governed by its own provisions in Hammurabi's code. A tavern keeper, a role often filled by women, who watered down her beer or accepted silver instead of grain as payment faced severe penalties. They played music. Harps, lyres, and drums appear throughout the visual and written record. They played board games, the royal game of yore, whose pieces we met in the royal tombs, was still being played 1,000 years after those tombs were sealed, the rules finally written down on a tablet that has allowed modern scholars to reconstruct the game entirely. They told jokes. Several Babylonian jokes have survived, and while humor does not always travel well across 4 millennia, the structure of them, the setup, the subverted expectation, the punchline, is entirely recognizable. But perhaps the most quietly astonishing intellectual achievement of old Babylonian civilization was happening not in the law courts or the markets or the taverns, but in the temples, where the priests were watching the sky. Babylonian astronomers, or more precisely, astronomer priests, because the two roles were inseparable, had been observing and recording the movements of celestial bodies for generations. By the old Babylonian period, they had accumulated data precise enough to allow them to predict astronomical events with remarkable accuracy. They could predict lunar eclipses. They had identified and named the planets visible to the naked eye. They had divided the sky into the constellations of the zodiac, a system so accurate and so elegant that it formed the foundation of astronomical thinking for the next 2,000 years, and whose echoes persist, transformed almost beyond recognition, in the horoscope columns of modern newspapers. They believed, with complete sincerity, that the movements of the heavens communicated the intentions of the gods, that a lunar eclipse was not a mechanical event but a message, that the appearance of the planet we call Venus on a particular horizon at a particular moment meant something specific and interpretable about what the coming season would bring. We do not share that belief, but in pursuing it, with rigorous nightly observation across century after century, they produced something that transcended its original purpose entirely. They produced science, the habit of watching carefully, of recording what you see, of comparing this year's sky to last year's, and the year before that, and the century before that, of trusting the accumulated record over the impression of a single night. The sky above Babylon was the same sky above us now, the same stars in their slow rotation, the same moon pulling at the same river. Let that thought settle gently. A priest on a high rooftop, the city breathing softly below him, his eyes lifted to the darkness above, a clay tablet balanced in his hands. Watching, recording, trying to understand what the universe was saying. And finding, in the effort of watching, something more durable than any answer. The practice itself, the long, patient, humble act of paying attention. The priests have lowered their eyes from the sky now. The city of Babylon, that vast breathing cosmopolitan place of beer and music and carved lore, is about to experience one of those sudden disruptions that punctuate Mesopotamian history like a sharp intake of breath. It comes, this time, from the northwest. Around 1595 BCE, a people called the Hittites, a powerful, iron-working civilization based in the highlands of what is now central Turkey, swept down into Mesopotamia in a raid of extraordinary audacity. They reached Babylon itself. They sacked it. They carried off the statue of Marduk, the great god of the city, which was not merely a religious outrage but a political and psychological one. To take a city's god was to take its identity, its legitimacy, its sense of divine protection. And then, as suddenly as they had arrived, the Hittites withdrew. Back north, back to their own affairs, leaving Babylon stunned and leaderless and open. Into that vacuum stepped a people about whom we know, frustratingly, relatively little. They are called the Kassites. They came originally from the Zagros mountain region to the east, and they had been filtering into Babylonian society for some time before the Hittite raid created the opening they needed. They were not, by any measure, cultural destroyers. Quite the opposite. The Kassites looked at Babylonian civilization and did what the Amorites had done before them, what the Akkadians had done before that. They absorbed it, adopted it, honored it, and made it their own. The Kassite kings took Babylonian names. They worshipped Babylonian gods. They rebuilt the temples, including eventually recovering the statue of Marduk and restoring it to its place in the Asagila. They ruled Babylon for approximately 400 years, longer than any other dynasty in the city's long history, and in doing so they gave Mesopotamia something it had rarely experienced before. Stability. Quiet, unspectacular, enormously valuable stability. This is one of those stretches of history that is difficult to make dramatic, because its great gift was precisely the absence of drama. No empire-building conqueror striding across the landscape. No sudden collapse, no burning cities, no lamentations pressed into clay in the aftermath of catastrophe. Instead, generation after generation of Kassite kings managing a complex civilization with competent, steady hands, keeping the irrigation canals flowing, the temples funded, the trade routes open. And the trade routes, in this period, was something to behold. Because the Kassite period coincided with what archaeologists and historians sometimes call the Late Bronze Age international system, a remarkable, genuinely surprising network of diplomatic and commercial exchange that linked the great civilizations of the ancient Near East into something resembling, however loosely, a community of nations. We know about this network in extraordinary detail because of a discovery made in 1887 in the Egyptian desert near a place called Amarna. A local woman digging in the ruins stumbled upon a cache of clay tablets, hundreds of them, written in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the age, the ancient world's equivalent of Latin or French in later European diplomacy. They turned out to be the actual correspondence between the Egyptian pharaohs and the rulers of the great powers of the age. Babylonia, Assyria, the Hittites, the kingdom of Mitanni, the rulers of Cyprus and Canaan. The Amarna letters, as they came to be called, are one of the most remarkable documentary discoveries in the history of archaeology. They pull back a curtain that 3,000 years of silence had drawn across an entire world and reveal something startlingly human on the other side. The great kings called each other brother. They sent gifts of extraordinary value, gold from Egypt, lapis lazuli from Babylonia, fine oils and textiles and horses, as tokens of alliance and mutual regard. They arranged marriages between their dynasties, sending their daughters across hundreds of miles to wed foreign kings, accompanied by vast dowries and long lists of the household goods included therein. One Babylonian king writes to the pharaoh with barely concealed irritation, complaining that the gold sent as a gift was insufficient, that when it was melted down, it barely covered the palm of his hand. The pharaoh, one imagines, was not entirely pleased to receive this assessment. They also wrote about their anxieties, about neighboring powers growing too strong, about trade disruptions, about messengers who had been held too long in foreign courts and not properly fed or housed during their stay. The kings of the Late Bronze Age, for all the enormous distances between them and all the ceremonial grandeur that surrounded them, communicated with a directness and occasional testiness that makes them feel, across 3,000 years, remarkably present. Within Babylonia itself, the Kassite period produced its own quiet intellectual achievements. The great canonical lists that would form the backbone of Mesopotamian scholarship for centuries Lists of omens, of stars, of plants, of stones, of medical symptoms were compiled and standardized in this era. The Epic of Gilgamesh, that oldest of literary masterpieces, was assembled into something close to the form in which it has survived, its scattered earlier versions gathered and shaped by a scholar scribe named Sinleku Nini into a coherent and deeply moving whole. Sinleku Nini. His name has survived. He is the first editor in recorded history, the first person we know of who took existing texts and shaped them deliberately into a new and greater form. He understood that Gilgamesh's questions about friendship, about loss, about the desperate human desire not to disappear, deserved to be preserved with the greatest possible care. He was right. Outside of Babylonia, the wider world of the Late Bronze Age was changing in ways that would eventually reach even into the quiet stability of the Kassite kingdom. New peoples were moving. Trade networks that had functioned for centuries were beginning to strain. The great palaces of the Aegean, Mycenae, Tiryns, the Minoan centers of Crete, were approaching the mysterious collapse that would plunge much of the eastern Mediterranean into a dark age from which it would take centuries to recover. What caused the Late Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BCE, remains one of the great unresolved questions of ancient history. Climate change, drought, internal rebellions, the disruptions caused by the mysterious sea peoples who appear in Egyptian records attacking from the Mediterranean. Most historians now believe it was a combination of all of these things, a cascade of interconnected failures that brought down interconnected systems with terrible swiftness. Babylonia survived the collapse, but diminished. The Kassite dynasty finally fell around 1155 BCE, brought low by renewed Elamite aggression from the east. Smaller dynasties succeeded one another in Babylon with a frequency that suggests instability rather than strength. The great international correspondence of the Amarna Age was over. The wide, well-traveled roads between kingdoms had grown quiet again. But to the north, something was stirring. A city-state that had spent centuries as a secondary power, often dominated by its southern neighbors, often threatened by the same waves of migration and invasion that had reshaped Mesopotamia again and again, was slowly and methodically building something new. A city on the upper reaches of the Tigris River, surrounded by productive agricultural land and well-placed for both defense and trade. A city whose people were tough, disciplined, and deeply proud of their traditions. A city whose kings had long memories and longer ambitions. Its name was Ashur, and the people who called it home called themselves, after their city and their god, the Assyrians. Let the quiet of these centuries settle over you like the long, unhurried turning of the stars that the Babylonian priests tracked with such patience. History does not always move in sudden lurches. Sometimes it accumulates, slowly and invisibly, like silt deposited by a river that has not flooded this season, nor the last, nor the one before, but which is building, grain by grain, towards something. Towards something that, when it finally moves, will move with a force that the ancient world has not yet seen. Rest now in the quiet before it. The quiet is over. What emerges from the northern reaches of Mesopotamia in the centuries around 900 BCE is unlike anything the ancient world has produced before. Not simply in its scale, though the scale is staggering. Not simply in its violence, though the violence is real and the Assyrians made no effort to conceal it. Quite the opposite. What makes the Assyrian Empire genuinely new, genuinely different from the empires that preceded it, is the totality of its organization. The cold, systematic, almost engineering-minded way in which it approached the problem of building and maintaining power across an enormous and fractious territory. The Assyrians did not stumble into empire. They designed it. They began, as we left them, in the city of Ashur, an ancient trading city on the upper Tigris whose merchants had been conducting long-distance commerce across the Near East for centuries. The Assyrians were not newcomers to ambition. Their earlier empire, what historians call the Old Assyrian and Middle Assyrian periods, had already demonstrated their capacity for organized expansion. But it was in the Neo-Assyrian period, roughly 911 BCE onward, that the full, almost overwhelming force of what they had been building was finally unleashed. The Assyrian army was the most formidable military instrument the ancient world had yet produced. And it was formidable not primarily because of the bravery of its soldiers, though Assyrian soldiers were rigorously trained and fiercely proud. It was formidable because of its organization, its logistics, its engineering. The Assyrians were the first people in history to field a professional standing army, soldiers who were soldiers full-time, year-round, paid and equipped by the state rather than called up seasonally from the farming population as most ancient armies were. This meant they could campaign in any season. It meant their skills were continuously sharpened rather than allowed to rust between harvests. It meant the Assyrian state had to develop, of necessity, an extraordinary logistical apparatus to feed, arm, and supply this permanent force, and in developing that apparatus, it became something genuinely new in the world, a military state in the fullest sense. They were engineers of war in ways that consistently startled their enemies. They built siege ramps of packed earth against the walls of cities that believed themselves impregnable. They used battering rams mounted on wheeled wooden frames, protected by soldiers with shields, to break through gates that had never been breached. They diverted rivers to flood enemy positions, or drained them to deny water to besieged cities. When they encountered a river too wide or too deep to ford, they crossed it, soldiers inflating animal skins to use as floats, equipment carried on reed rafts, the entire army moving with a problem-solving practicality that speaks to a culture that viewed obstacles as engineering challenges rather than divine prohibitions. The Assyrian kings recorded their campaigns in extraordinary detail. On the walls of their palaces, vast, elaborate complexes whose ruins have yielded some of the most spectacular sculptural programs in the history of ancient art, they commissioned long narrative reliefs showing battles, sieges, hunts, and triumphal processions in meticulous carved stone. These are not merely boasts. They are, in their way, a form of military documentation. The chariots are depicted accurately. The siege equipment is shown in working detail. The landscapes, the mountains, the marshes, the foreign cities, are rendered with a specificity that has allowed modern archaeologists to identify real locations from carved images made nearly 3,000 years ago. The kings also recorded, with complete frankness, the fates of those who resisted them. Peoples deported, cities burned, rebellious kings punished in ways designed to be remembered and repeated, to travel ahead of the Assyrian advance like a shadow, persuading the next city in their path that cooperation was preferable to resistance. This frankness has given the Assyrians a fearsome reputation that is not entirely undeserved. They were capable of great cruelty, and they knew it, and they used it deliberately as an instrument of policy. But to understand the Assyrians only through their violence is to miss something essential about who they were. Because the same kings who recorded their military campaigns with such unflinching clarity also built libraries. The greatest of these was assembled in the city of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital at the height of its power, a city of perhaps 100,000 people, surrounded by a massive wall that the ancient sources describe as wide enough for 3 chariots to drive along its top side by side. And within that city, in the great palace of a king named Ashurbanipal who ruled from 668 BCE, there was something that has no real precedent in the ancient world. A systematic, deliberate, royally funded collection of human knowledge. Ashurbanipal was unusual among Assyrian kings in that he was, by his own account and by the evidence of the tablets themselves, genuinely literate. Not merely able to read and write in a ceremonial sense, but actively intellectually engaged, curious, voracious, personally involved in the project of gathering texts from across the known world and having them copied, translated, catalogued, and stored in his palace library. He sent agents across Mesopotamia with instructions to find important texts and bring them back or copy them on the spot. Temples, private collections, ancient archives, all were sources. The library of Ashurbanipal eventually contained tens of thousands of clay tablets covering every field of knowledge that Mesopotamian scholarship had accumulated over 2,000 years. Omen literature, medical texts, mathematical tables, dictionaries, grammatical treatises, ritual instructions, myths, epics, including a copy, in fact, multiple copies, of the Epic of Gilgamesh. When the library was excavated in the 19th century CE, those tablets were still there, buried under the rubble of Nineveh's destruction, preserved by the very fire that had consumed the palace above them, the heat baking the clay harder, the collapsed roof protecting them from the elements for 2.5 millennia. It is because of Ashurbanipal's obsessive, systematic gathering of knowledge that we can read Gilgamesh today. It is because of a conquering king's library that the world's oldest story survived. History does not always deliver its ironies gently. The Assyrian Empire at its height stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt, at certain points even into Egypt itself, a fact that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Ashurbanipal's grandfather, Sennacherib, had destroyed Babylon in a fit of rage after a rebellion, an act so shocking to the Mesopotamian world that it sent reverberations through the political and religious landscape for generations. Ashurbanipal himself eventually conquered Thebes, in Upper Egypt, one of the most sacred cities of the ancient world, and described the plunder with the same detailed satisfaction he brought to everything else he recorded. And yet, within decades of Ashurbanipal's death, the empire he had inherited and expanded was unraveling with a speed that must have seemed, to those living through it, almost incomprehensible. The Assyrian model of governance, provinces administered by appointed governors answerable to the king, populations deported and resettled to break up regional loyalties, constant military campaigning to maintain the fear that kept the system functioning, required a level of resources and energy that even the most efficiently organized state in the ancient world could not sustain indefinitely. The empire was vast, and vast empires have long borders, and long borders have many enemies. The Medes, a powerful people from the Iranian plateau to the east, had been growing in strength for decades. The Babylonians, long resentful of Assyrian domination, saw their opportunity. In 612 BCE, a combined Median and Babylonian army besieged Nineveh. The city that had seemed, from the inside, eternal, with its massive walls, its great palace, its library of all human knowledge, fell after a siege of only 3 months. The ancient sources say the Tigris River flooded that year and breached the walls. Perhaps. Or perhaps the walls were simply not enough. They never are, in the end. Nineveh was burned. The palace collapsed. The library fell into the earth, where it would sleep for 2,000 years before the 19th century's archaeologists came with their trowels and their notebooks and pulled it back into the light. The Assyrian Empire, the most powerful political entity the ancient world had yet produced, was gone in a decade. The great deported populations it had scattered across the Near East remained scattered. The roads it had built remained, for a while, useful to whoever now controlled them. The knowledge preserved in Ashurbanipal's library survived, buried and waiting. And in Babylon, now free, a new king was preparing to build something that the whole world would remember. Let the silence of fallen Nineveh settle around you. The great carved reliefs still in the rubble, the stone kings and stone battles slowly being covered by the slow accumulation of the earth. The stars above the ruined city, indifferent and permanent, the same stars the Babylonian priests had charted and named and tried so patiently to understand. Out of the rubble and the dak, one more chapter, one more city, one more flame before the long night comes. Babylon breathes again. After centuries of Assyrian dominance, of tribute paid, of kings appointed or approved from the north, of the long, humiliating experience of a proud and ancient city living in the shadow of another's power, Babylon is free. And it intends, with everything it has, to make something extraordinary of that freedom. The man who leads it into this final flowering is a king named Nabopolassar. He is the founder of what historians call the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the last great indigenous empire of ancient Mesopotamia. He fought alongside the Medes to bring down Nineveh, and in doing so he set in motion a last, brief, luminous chapter in the story we have been telling since the very beginning. Since the dark soil and the river and the first seeds pressed into the earth by hands that had no idea what they were starting. But it is Nabopolassar's son who history remembers. Nebuchadnezzar II, king of Babylon for 43 years, from 605 to 562 BCE. A name that has echoed through 3,000 years of human memory, through the Hebrew Bible, through Greek histories, through the long tradition of Western imagination, and which still carries, even now, a weight and a resonance that very few names from the ancient world can match. He was, by any honest accounting, a remarkable figure. A military commander of the First Order, it was Nebuchadnezzar who completed the destruction of Assyrian power, who campaigned through Syria and Canaan and brought the full weight of Babylonian ambition to bear on the western reaches of the known world. It was Nebuchadnezzar who besieged and destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BCE, who carried the population of Judah into the captivity that the Hebrew Bible calls the Babylonian exile, one of the most consequential events in the history of religion, because it was during those decades in Babylon that the Jewish people, separated from their temple and their land, deepened and transformed their understanding of their own faith in ways that would shape Judaism, Christianity, and Islam for thousands of years to come. But Nebuchadnezzar was not only a destroyer, he was, with equal passion and on an almost incomprehensible scale, a builder. He rebuilt Babylon, not restored, rebuilt, from its foundations upward, into the largest and most spectacular city the ancient world had ever seen. Contemporary estimates suggest that at its height under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon may have housed as many as 200,000 people within its walls. Those walls themselves were a wonder, a double ring of massive mud brick fortifications so wide at the top that, according to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, 4 chariots could drive abreast along them. Whether that is precisely accurate, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that the walls of Babylon were, by the evidence of archaeology, genuinely extraordinary. Thick enough and tall enough to make the city seem, from the outside, almost geological, like something that had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. Through the walls ran a great processional avenue, the Ibashabu, which meant something close to the enemy shall never pass. It was paved with stone imported from great distances, its sides lined with walls of glazed brick depicting lions in brilliant blue and gold and white, the lion being the symbol of Ishtar, goddess of love and war, whose great gate stood at the avenue's northern end. The Ishtar Gate. Even in reconstruction, a substantial portion of it was excavated in the early 20th century, reassembled, and now stands in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. It stops people in their tracks. Deep blue glazed brick, the color of a midsummer sky just after sunset. Rows of dragons and bulls in raised relief, marching in stately procession across its surface. It was, in its original form, coated in places with gold that caught the Mesopotamian sun and announced to every visitor, every ambassador, every foreign dignitary who passed beneath it exactly what kind of city this was and exactly what kind of king had built it. A city that intended to be eternal. And somewhere within that city, though its precise location has never been conclusively established by archaeology, and may never be, stood something that the ancient Greeks would eventually list among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The story attached to them is one of the most romantic in the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar, it was said, had married a princess from the Median highlands, a woman named Amytes, who had grown up among the green mountain forests and terraced slopes of her homeland and who found the flat, sun-baked plains of Babylon alien and sorrowful. And so her husband, the most powerful king in the world, built her a mountain. A series of terraced gardens rising in stages, planted with trees and flowers and vines from every corner of the empire, irrigated by an elaborate system of screws and pumps that lifted water from the Euphrates to the highest levels, so that it cascaded downward through the greenery in what must have seemed, to the citizens of a largely treeless plain, like something from another world entirely. Whether the Hanging Gardens truly existed precisely as described, or whether they have been somewhat embellished in the telling and retelling across centuries, or whether, as some scholars have recently proposed, they were actually located in Nineveh and attributed to Babylon through a confusion of later sources, we cannot say with complete certainty. The archaeological evidence remains elusive, but the image endures, and it endures for a reason. Because it captures something true about Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon even if the specific details are uncertain. It was a city that believed it could do anything, that believed resources and will and engineering ingenuity could overcome any obstacle, including the obstacle of geography itself. That if the land did not provide what was wanted, you simply built what the land lacked. It was, in that sense, the most perfectly Mesopotamian city that had ever existed. The inheritor of every ambition, every technique, every intellectual tradition that stretched back through the Assyrians and the Kassites and the Babylonians of Hammurabi's time and the kings of Ur and the scribes of Uruk, all the way back to those first farmers pressing seeds into the dark silt beside the river. But empires, as we have seen again and again in this long story, do not last forever. After Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire entered a period of instability that has a melancholy familiarity about it. Kings succeeding one another too quickly. Caught conspiracies. The last king, a man named Nabonidus, proved so eccentric in his religious devotions, he neglected the great festival of Marduk, the most important ritual in the Babylonian calendar, for years at a time, apparently absorbed in the worship of the moon god Sin, that he alienated the very priestly establishment whose support was essential to legitimate kingship in Mesopotamia. He spent years away from Babylon, residing at an oasis in the Arabian desert, leaving the city in the hands of his son Belshazzar. To the east, a new power was rising with a speed and totality that must have seemed, to those watching it happen, almost supernatural. The Persian Empire, under its king Cyrus the Great, had already absorbed the Median Kingdom, the Lydian Kingdom of Western Anatolia, and vast territories across the Iranian plateau. It was the largest empire the world had yet seen, even larger than the Assyrian Empire at its height, and it was still expanding. In 539 BCE, the Persian army under the command of a general named Gobryas approached the walls of Babylon. What followed was, by the standards of ancient conquest, remarkably undramatic. According to the ancient sources, both Babylonian chronicles written at the time and later Greek accounts, Babylon was taken with minimal resistance. The Persian army may have diverted the Euphrates River where it flowed under the city walls, allowing them to enter along the riverbed. Or perhaps the gates were simply opened by a population and a priesthood who had grown disillusioned with Nabonidus and saw in Cyrus, with his reputation for tolerance and his promise to restore the rights of Marduk, something preferable to what they already had. Cyrus entered Babylon and declared himself its liberator rather than its conqueror. He restored the statue of Marduk. He permitted the peoples who had been deported to Babylonia by Nebuchadnezzar, including the Jewish exiles, to return to their homelands, earning himself a place in the Hebrew Bible as a figure chosen and guided by God. He presented himself not as the destroyer of Babylonian civilization, but as its inheritor and protector. It was an extraordinarily sophisticated piece of political theater, and it worked. Babylon continued to exist as a great city for centuries after the Persian conquest. Alexander the Great would enter it in 331 BCE and declare his intention to make it the capital of his own empire, dying there, perhaps not coincidentally, in 323 BCE before that plan could be realized. The city slowly diminished through the Hellenistic and Parthian periods, its population drifting away, its irrigation canals silting up, its great mud brick buildings softening in the rain and the wind and the long indifferent passage of time. The last known cuneiform tablet was written in 75 CE, 1,000 years after the fall of Babylon to Cyrus, nearly 3,000 years after the first symbols had been pressed into wet clay in the temple archives of Uruk. A scribe, in a tradition so ancient it had outlasted every empire that had ever claimed Mesopotamia, pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay one final time. And then silence. The rivers still flow. The Tigris and the Euphrates still make their patient journey southward across the flat alluvial plain, still depositing their dark silt, still flooding in the spring, still sustaining life in the landscape where all of this began. The tells, those distinctive mounded hills that mark the sites of buried ancient cities across modern Iraq, still rise gently from the plain, still holding within them the ruins of walls and temples and houses and schools and taverns and the accumulated, compressed remains of thousands of years of human life. Beneath one of those tells, perhaps, Sargon's lost capital of Akkad is still waiting to be found. In a museum in Istanbul, a clay tablet holds the lament over the destruction of Ur, the poet's grief still legible in the pressed marks of a stylus held by hands that turned to dust 4,000 years ago. In Berlin, the lions of the Ishtar Gate still pace their eternal procession across their field of deep blue. In Philadelphia and London and Baghdad, the golden headdresses of Yor's queens still tremble at a breath of air, as delicate as the day they were made. And in libraries and universities and on the screens of people who simply became curious one day about where writing came from, or who built the first cities, or what the oldest story in the world is about, the Epic of Gilgamesh is still being read, still asking its ancient, unanswerable, entirely necessary question. The question that Gilgamesh asked standing at the walls of Uruk, looking out at the flat horizon, knowing what was coming for him as it comes for all of us. Why must we die? And what do we leave behind? What Mesopotamia left behind is everything. The cities, the writing, the law, the mathematics, the astronomy, the literature, the bureaucracy, the empire, the library, the idea that knowledge should be gathered and preserved and passed on. All of it flows forward from that first handful of grain pressed into the dark earth beside a river, by hands whose names we will never know. You have been there tonight, in the only way any of us ever can be. In the imagination. In the long, quiet act of listening. The rivers are still running. The stars the Babylonian priests charted are still turning slowly overhead. Rest now. Let it all settle, slowly, like silt carried gently to the riverbed. Like the dark earth, receiving the seed, in the oldest silence in the world.